thank you so much for coming today and for coming early as well to listen to a little bit about what I'm hoping that you will find enjoyable about our program. I think I've met most of you, but in case you are new to us today, I'm Sanford Dole, and I am the director of this group. And as I say, it's a pleasure to have you all here today. We have a wonderful show lined up for you. It's very delightful, all music from the Renaissance era. Now, I decided for this lecture today, rather than give you a detailed biographical description of all of the composers, because there are 10 of them in this program, the program notes talk more about that, talk about who they are, where they're from, how they interact with each other, that sort of thing. So I'm going to tell you rather more musical things to listen for and about how the music evolved. And then I'll end a little bit early, at which time I will then encourage you to read the program notes so that you can learn a little bit about the biographical data of the composers. We have, as I say, 10 composers. There are 3 that are German, 2 that are Spanish, 2 that are from the Low Countries, and then 1 each from England, Italy, and France. So I bring that up because in the Renaissance era, and the music you're going to hear, they were all largely influenced by what was going on in Italy at the time. And as a result, there are many similarities among all of the pieces you're going to hear. So even though they are geographically separated, and even back 400 years ago, they were able to travel and listen to each other's music and learn from each other. And so there are some similarities. The Renaissance era, in the books, they talk about that it goes from the mid-1400s to around 1600. As I was choosing music for this program, I decided that the music that I liked the best and was interested in happened to all be written largely between 1570 and 1620. So this is late Renaissance. This is the end of the era, and actually those last 20 years are as the era is becoming the Baroque era, so the late Renaissance, early Baroque. And what led up to this era is the fact that the first music publications started happening in Venice at around 1500. And as a result of that, printed scores, began to be disseminated throughout Europe. And as the cognoscenti, the people that, the wealthy people that could get their hands on these scores, began to be singing together in chamber as a form of recreation, that there became to be much more knowledge and awareness of musical styles that were going on. And that was coming out of Venice. And the Renaissance era, it seemed to be that a real locus for that emerging thought, Renaissance, which means rebirth, and after the Middle Ages, then we're coming into this new era. The secular humanism was coming into play, and while the visual art world there was a lot of activity going on in Florence, the painting, and in Rome, of course. Leonardo and Michelangelo were working in Florence and in Rome. While that was happening there, for whatever reason, in Venice, there was a real center for musical development. And as a result of this, Italy in general, and Venice in particular, musicians from all over Europe, generally, if they were anybody with a real knowledge or understanding, made a point of traveling to Italy to study and to be influenced by and to gain education that any composer of note had on his resume, the fact that he studied in Italy. In most cases, they spent many years there, or a few or many years, and then ended up returning back to their homeland and brought their knowledge of music that they had learned in Italy with them. And so, as a result of that Italian influence is a lot of the pieces you're going to hear tonight runs throughout all of those pieces. The music is largely rather ornate, filigree in a certain sense, if you will. As we got through towards the end of the 1500s, they were adding parts and adding motion to the music. It was always based on the text and I'll be talking about some of the text things to listen for in a bit. However, they like the bigger, the grander, and most of our pieces are either in 5 voice parts, and in a couple of cases 6 voice parts, and then we have one 7-part piece, which is really kind of cool because the 7 parts are going on the whole time. And then finally we have a couple double choir pieces with 8 parts, 4 and 4. And that was sort of the standard norm. Almost all of these pieces are written with the compositional technique known as imitative counterpoint. Most of the pieces begin with a single line laying out some sort of a musical phrase. Da 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 da, and then the next part comes in da 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 da, maybe then da 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 da. And you'll hear a lot that happening quite a bit. That's the style that they were writing in. Not so much vertical. Most music written today is much more chords. That it's thought about as the harmonic structure of the entire chord, going from beat to beat. In the music of the Renaissance, the harmony is a result of what the individual lines are doing, so that there's a single line going along. When you add the second line in, often beginning with that, imitating what the first line did, then when the 2 parts come together and then the third part, the harmony is created as a result of what the individual lines are doing. And not that this matters to you, but of course at the time, music was not published in score form, like we see it, all the parts on one page together. Rather, you had a 1-part book for the soprano 1s and a separate book for the soprano 2s, and it just is a single line that goes along, and you just have to count, and there's no bar lines either, so you have to really just be on it, and when you sing together, then it all magically works together. We are lucky today that we can actually have it printed out and all together so you know who's doing what when, and where to get your note from, for instance. In fact, this is an aside, back when they were doing things by hand, and even when they began publishing scores, the music is written in big notes, round, a whole note, which we think of as 4 beats, as a whole note, representing 4 beats in a measure. That actually, back then, represented 2 beats, or maybe even 1 beat. And so that the music is written, and there's a couple scores here which I actually redid for us to bring it into more a modern notation look, shortening the length of the values of the notes so that it would be easier for us to read. That's just an aside. Anyway, so they were using the text, as hopefully any good composer of vocal music does, and setting the text in a way which enlivens the text, the meaning of the words. And so there's a couple things that, these are rather subtle, but as I've been setting the pieces and working in rehearsals with the choir, there's moments in this music which really turn me on, which are just really exciting of what the composer has done to paint the text. So I just want to point them out to you so you know kind of something to listen for. In the very first piece we're doing, the Magnificat, the Song of Mary, which you probably have heard many settings of, there is a line in that piece which is Timentibus eum. The translation is, at the moment in the text where Mary is saying, and his mercy is from generation to generation to them that fear him. At the moment where the words to them that fear him, it's Timentibus eum is the Latin. And what the music does is Timentibus eum, and the next part, Timentibus eum, which that chromatic half-step motion is very advanced for the time. And it sounds much more like a modern piece than it does something written 400 years ago. And so I just find that my ear first, when I first heard this, like, wow, that's interesting, listen to that. But this is just one of those things that I do as a musician. Da, 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 da. I kind of pull in, my body has a physical manifestation of that musical figure. Da, 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 da. And it's to them that fear him. It's that to them that fear him, to them that fear him. And I kind of have that gesture there. So it's just one of those little things that the composer is thinking about as a way to enliven the meaning of the text. So that's one little spot that I think is kind of fun. At the end of the piece, the end of the concert, the next to the last piece, Vidente Stellam, there are 2, which is an Epiphany text that tells the story of when the Magi come and find the baby in the manger. There are two little moments in that which I think really exemplify the text in a really beautiful way, and I think you will be able to hear. During the middle of the text, it says, "The Magi find the boy and Mary and fall prostrate to worship him." And right at the moment where it says, "and fall prostrate," the music becomes very still, and when you see it on the page, it's very horizontal. Just long chords that are just very still like that. And to me, it's that image of the Magi being prostrate on the ground. It's been very active up to that point, and then suddenly, it's just these long chords very still. And to me, I just see that as being, oh, look, there they are lying prostrate on the ground. And then they get up and the music then gets to be more enlivened again. It's just a little moment, it's one of those little subtle things. But as I was learning, it's like, wow, look at that. That really is visually showing us the vision of them being prostrate. And then towards the end of that piece, when they bring out their gifts, the gold, frankincense, and myrrh, at the moment it's been kind of going along and not too busy. And suddenly, at the word aurum, which means gold, the music goes bright, and suddenly it's aurum, aurum. Oh, and they brought gold. Yes, gold. It kind of has that feeling suddenly in the music. And you know that the frankincense or myrrh is kind of normal, but the gold is very sparkly and bright. And you'll hear the choir bring that out. And it's just a moment of fun musicality that the composer is bringing to the music. Let me see. All of this style and way of working is what became known as the Venetian school of composing music. As we get towards the end of the 15th century, the 16th century, the end of the 1500s, Andrea Gabrielli, who is the uncle of the famous Giovanni Gabrielli, was a teacher there. And through his influence and other people in Venice, they were developing this idea of the interpretative counterpoint, lots of parts going on. Andrea was the teacher of several of the composers that are on tonight's program, people that came to Venice and studied, including his nephew, Giovanni. They both worked in the famous St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, and it's an incredibly wonderful church. Acoustically, it's really magical there. And I think it might have to do with the fact that the building has such wonderful acoustics that they developed the double choir style or multiple choir style. There's the cori spezzati is the word I use in the program notes, which is the divided choirs. And I have had the pleasure of, with this group, performing in St. Mark's a few years ago, and I discovered when I was there that there are these big balconies up above, and that they really do lend themselves to having choirs on each side and another choir at the back. And we are going to be doing one number tonight, the Hodie Christus Natus Est, Christ is Born Today, by Giovanni Gabrielli, composed to be performed in St. Mark's and that double choir idea. We're actually going to physically separate the choirs so you get a sense of the double choir aspect. I mentioned that most of the pieces we're doing today are in 5 parts. They are usually 2 soprano parts, and then alto, tenor, bass. And the soprano parts are equal voices as far as range-wise, high and low, it's equal range. And so, unlike contemporary music, where more often than not, if you have 2 soprano parts, there's a higher soprano part and a lower soprano part that doesn't go quite so high. In this case, all the soprano parts are equal range. And so I decided to put both first and second sopranos on the soprano 1 part and first and second sopranos on the soprano 2 part. And I'm gesturing like this because I actually, for the double choir piece, I have them on 2 sides of the room. And I assigned most of the pieces that are with these 2 soprano parts. So the upper soprano parts are all the sopranos on this side, and the other sopranos are on that side. And even though all 5 parts are going on simultaneously, you will be able to, I think, really hear the imitation going on with the sopranos on this side introduce something and the sopranos on this side echo it and back and forth, and that should really play up how all the interplay is working among all the parts. Now there is a couple pieces that have an interesting technique which I want to point out to you of composing. There's the 2 soprano parts I just talked about. Well, there's a piece, it's the 3rd piece on the program, the Ave Virgo Sanctissima. And what the composer has done in that case is that there is a melody which is then sung in canon. You know what a canon is a round. Well, you'll hear the one group, actually it's all of the first sopranos and first altos on the upper line, and then 2 measures later, the rest of the sopranos and altos will come in and singing the very same melody, but 2 bars later. So they're continually in canon like that, and creating, it's interesting how their harmony can change, even though the parts are the same. The first part will sing a phrase, and then end while the second part is singing that same phrase. When the first part comes back in, they're coming in at a different note, which then changes the harmonic structure, and so that the piece kind of evolves as it goes along in an interesting way harmonically, even though the parts are singing, in canon exactly the same phrase as we go. It's really quite beautiful. Underneath those 2 parts, then, we have the men, in this case, divided into 3 parts, tenors, baritones, and basses, going along the entire time, setting up a nice harmonic underpinning, sort of a world in which this canon sort of floats along on top. It's really quite lovely. That same technique is used at the very end of the Mass setting we are doing tonight, the Agnus Dei of the Mass. When we get there, you'll see the same technique is employed. The Mass has been in 4 voices the whole time until we get to the last movement, and suddenly the sopranos divide, and we have the same technique of writing in canon. The Agnus Dei happens in canon between the 2 soprano parts throughout. And it works quite well. So, getting to the Mass, I want to kind of introduce a little bit about that. So I talked about how in Venice, the music is the idea of imitative counterpoint, and the late Renaissance era, the music is much more filigree and much is happening and active and overlapping and all of that. Well, as a result of that, in Rome, at the Vatican, they were saying, hey, we know that you think you're paying attention to the words, but there's so much going on musically that we're not getting the words. Maybe you need to simplify the music a little bit so that we can understand the words, which are the most important part of the service. So Palestrina, who worked at St. Peter's in Rome, took that to heart, and they were his boss, of course. So he was writing music which was only in 4 parts, not in the 5, 6, 7 parts that a lot of the Venetian composers were doing, and writing in a way that was, the counterpoint was not so busy, such that the text could come through, and the primacy of the text was the important thing that came through better. And so he was, of course, a teacher as well. One of his big students in Rome, this is Palestrina in Rome, was Victoria, the great Spanish Renaissance composer, Tomás Luis de Victoria. And he was influenced by that more simple style. Victoria went back to Spain. You'll read about him in the program notes, about his story. And was writing in a way which is very clear and obvious and works really quite well. And so I just want to point that out to you, that you'll hear, after the whole first half of the concert, when everything is in 5, 6, and 7 parts, much more thicker, that when in the second half of the program, we're featuring the music of Victoria. There is his famous motet, O Magnum Mysterium, the wonderful Christmas text that, isn't it a miracle that there's animals were present at the birth of Jesus? And his motet, O Magnum Mysterium, is perhaps the greatest Christmas motet ever written. It's one of my absolute favorites. I'm sure that almost all of you have heard this piece before, and I just couldn't not do it because it's a real favorite of mine and so beautiful and exquisite. And then, so it's only in 4 parts and very clear. I think you'll have no trouble understanding the text. Then I decided to, let's do a Christmas Mass as well in a program like this of sacred music from the Renaissance. And I've chosen Victoria's Mass based on the O Magnum Mysterium motet. It's what we call a parody Mass. This was, again, a technique often used by composers of the era. They would take some pre-existing piece and use that as the basis for their Mass setting. In this case, the connection between the two is rather loose, I think, because there's not a lot that's obvious from the motet. However, you will note the influence. You may recognize the beginning of the motet goes, O Magnum Mysterium. I'm sure most of you have heard that already, and we'll recognize it when it comes up. The places that the Mass is based on that is at the very beginning in the Kyrie. It goes, Kyrie eleison, and then the altos come in, Kyrie eleison, etc. So you'll hear the connection there. Also at the beginning of the Sanctus movement, it goes Sanctus, very similar to the way the motet begins. Other than that, once we get past that introduction, the music takes off as it's setting the text in its own way. And you'll hear that it stays in 4 parts throughout, much clearer, and we get to much more homophonic setting where the chords line up. Speaking of homophonic, I mentioned Andrea Gabrielli in Venice earlier, who was a great teacher and was a composer in his own right, wonderful. Among his students was Hans Leo Hassler, who is the most performed composer on our concert tonight with 3 settings. All the others only have 2, but he has 3. I just happen to love his music. And you'll see that he was learned the techniques in Italy, but then went back to Germany and was working quite a bit in Germany. And so his music appeals to me as a modern composer who is used to writing things in a vertical chordally as opposed to a horizontal counterpoint, because his music is more along those lines. It has the nice chordal structures line up from chord to chord. And you'll hear that difference in his pieces, not so much the very first one, but in the later pieces, the Videnta Stellam and the other one from the I forget which one it is. Anyway, you'll hear that when you get to the Hans Leo Hassler pieces, that he tends to write more chordally this way, and then with moments of counterpoint interspersed in between. So I think that covers everything that I wanted to say about the music, things for you to listen for. I'm now going to stop talking so that you can have a chance to look and read through the program notes, where those of you who weren't here at the beginning, I decided today not to say too much biographical about the individual composers because there are 10 of them. Rather, I'm going to let you read the program notes right now so you get a sense of who they were and how they relate to each other, et cetera, and learn a little bit about their dates and where they lived. And therefore, you'll be fully educated, ready to enjoy this concert. We'll hope you do so much. Thank you so much for being here. And we'll see you in a few minutes. Thank you.